All right, today we are talking about the age of exploration. Remember last week we had mentioned the Renaissance period and how there was major change happening, especially in Italy, but those changes will then make their way through the rest of Western Europe over time. One of the major changes that's going to take place then, in about that same time, 1350, 1400, then you get into the 15th century or the 1400s as we begin to see the rise of the Portuguese Empire, and we see the rise of sailing. Up to this point, for many of the European powers, they viewed the ocean as a barrier. The ocean was a barrier. And so they didn't really look towards the ocean, they looked towards the land, I guess is one way to think about it. So they would see, like if you were in France and you got up to the Atlantic, then that's just a barrier, Maybe you can make it across to England because that's not too far, but maybe you go down the coast and get to Spain. But as far as going across the ocean or a long distance on the ocean, that was not something they were really thinking about. And so that became a barrier. But now, in the 15th century, what we're going to see, 15th century and then into the early 16th century, we're going to see that the ocean becomes a bridge instead of a barrier. And that's what we want to talk about today. Now, a lot of that begins with the Portuguese and the Portuguese Empire. Portugal is a very small country. Still today, it's a very small country, but it's had a huge impact on the world, especially given its relative size. Tremendous impact. And they created a huge empire. How did they do that? They did that through seeing the ocean as a bridge. The ocean becomes their connector to the rest of the world. They become very adept at sailing and building ships. They have access to wood from the mountains in Portugal. They've built ships. They learned how to navigate ships. Their ships were nimble. How's that a word? In other words, they had ships that they could really maneuver well. They knew how to do that. And they also knew how to navigate, which of course is important. I don't know if you have ever been out on the open ocean in a ship where you can't see anything but water. Okay? You get out there and you can't see anything but water. How do you figure out where you're going? Well, of course, today we have satellites and GPS and all kinds of electronic maps and so forth. So, if you get on one of those ships, you're usually not worried because you figure somebody else knows where they're going. Right? I go and speak on cruise boats. Believe it or not, that's one of the things that I do. It lets me travel cheaper, not free, but cheaper. In fact, I just found out recently I'm doing a cruise over Christmas break, pretty much almost the whole Christmas break, well, for a few days. And it's going to go from a place called Fort Lauderdale, very exotic place called Fort Lauderdale, and then it's going to end up at Los Angeles, or maybe you call it Los Angeles. And it's going to go through the Panama Canal. So you go through the Caribbean. We're going to go to south, and we're going to go to Cartagena, Colombia, and we're going to go to Panama. We're going to go to Nicaragua and Honduras, I think, and then Mexico, and then we're going to make our way around to Los Angeles. And then from Los Angeles, I have to hitchhike back to Lakeland. No, I'm going to fly back to Lakeland to make it back in time for classes. Okay. Well, anyway, when you're out there so I have done that. I don't know how many times this will be. This will probably be my 7th time speaking on a cruise boat. But when you get out there on the sea, whether I'm in the North Sea or the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean or the Indian Ocean, wherever I have been on one of these ships, when you get out there in the water, it all starts to look the same. I suppose, maybe you could look at some of the birds, or maybe you could see some of the fish, but you usually can't see them from up there. You might be able to notice a difference, and maybe the temperature and so forth. But still, how do you know where you are? And so this is what the Portuguese are going to come to do, especially with this guy we have here. His name is Prince Henry, who has the kind of nickname, right? The Navigator. Prince Henry the Navigator. And you can see this is in the 15th century. Starting in 1419, he begins a school for navigators. The Portuguese had the wood to build ships. They had a really good technique at building ships. But of course, the next component, you have the wood, you build the ships, you learn how to sail the ship, but then you have to know where you're going. So, let's say by the time you're in the 15th century now, the first half of the 15th century, we're seeing that the Portuguese get involved in sailing and using it for trade, and they're eventually going to use it to build an empire. Pretty substantial empire, in fact. So by 1441, this is when the Portuguese are involved in the slave trade. When they first begin to bring people from Africa to Europe, especially to Portugal. Now, I don't want to say this is the beginning of slave trade. Slave trade had been around for a very long time, and certainly slave trade from Africa had been around. Over on the east side, over here, near the Arabian Peninsula, that's where most of the slaves had come prior to this, on the east coast. The east coast of Africa, then, the slave trade was carried out by Muslim slave traders. Muslim ships, Muslim slave traders. And this is really, I think, where the Portuguese got the idea, because there were some slaves brought to Europe by Muslims. And what the Portuguese are really going to be interested in is, of course, making money and building an empire. But what they're really wanting to know is, where are the spices? They're looking at what the Muslims are bringing. The Muslims are the sort of middleman, if you will, the middle unit. In other words, they didn't have the spices. They didn't raise them or grow them or harvest them. They didn't have the slaves either. But they would obtain the spices. They would obtain slaves and other things, and then they would transport them and sell them and make a profit. All right, that's what they did. And the Portuguese thought, you know what? I bet we could make. They're making a lot of money. I bet we could make a lot of money. So their ultimate goal, of course, is to try to figure out where the spices come from. The word on the street was the spices were coming from India. Now, to get from Portugal to India, if you're trying to go overland, you're going to have a lot of problem, because you're going to have to go up against Muslim forces on land, and you're going to have to learn those routes, and a lot of it's very dry and all that kind of stuff. So this was not something the Portuguese knew they could do. But since they had easy access, of course, to the ocean, and they had ships, and they knew how to navigate, they thought, you know what? We could probably get to India, get those spices ourselves, and then bring them back and sell them. Make a lot of money. Now, what they did not know was how big Africa was. Africa was a whole lot bigger than what they thought. So they began sailing south to try to get around Africa. They kind of thought Africa, if you look at this, you see how the Mediterranean is. And you see how Africa joins up with Europe and kind of forms a sort of, almost looks like a lake. It's the Mediterranean Sea. They kind of thought that Africa did that over here too. That it bent around like this and it came close to India So they thought, you know what, if we just sail around Africa this way, it won't be that far, and we'll just come right up here to India. And, you know, this Indian Ocean they felt was probably much like the Mediterranean Sea. Does that make sense? Because they didn't know how big it was, the angle, and all that. So anyway, they began to sail down the coast of Africa. When they came down the coast of Africa, their ultimate goal was to get around Africa, but then they said, well, you know, what else do Muslims, what other trade are they involved in? Well, Muslims are involved in slave trade. They make money doing that. Maybe we can make some money doing that and, you know, corner the market on slave trade. So that's what they began to do. They came down the west coast of Africa. Basically, you know, you get south of the desert. The Sahara Desert is up there. And then you start getting into more equatorial Africa, right? And they began to sail down. Now, below this line here, is the unknown. You know, they had ventured down this way some, but no one had been down that far. Nobody knew how far this was. All right. The other thing that, of course, attracted them or interests them is that when they got down to the so-called hump of Africa, that's right here, this hump, this curve of Africa before it indents, and right in that area is about where the Niger River flows out. And there, they saw that the local people had gold. You know, like gold bracelet, gold necklace, gold nugget, you know, stuff like that. And that got them very excited. Gold. Where did you get this gold? How can we get this gold from you? What can we trade to you for this gold? We like this gold. Well, it turns out that the gold was, in fact, coming from the Niger River. So they weren't mining, they weren't digging underground to get it. They were panning for it. Right? You know what I'm talking about? They would sort of pick up sediment in the river, the banks of the river and stuff like that, and then they would slosh it around. You know, occasionally they would find pieces of gold that just flowed down the river. So that got them very excited about that, and they got involved in getting that gold. So the main thing in the beginning that the Portuguese were able to do was slaves, gold, and add to that ivory. Ivory, which of course are the tusks primarily of elephants. It's a white, makes a white shiny material that can be used for jewelry and other things like that. So these were the things that they were really looking for: slaves, ivory, and gold. So as they move down along the side there, they end up building, making forts and setting up their trade of, like, say, using the Canary Islands, some of these other islands along the coast, and setting up a place where they could go to shore, get these items, come back, regroup, and then sail back to Portugal. Now, I don't know how you think maybe the slave trade works, but this wasn't the Portuguese landing here and just going out and grabbing guys, grabbing people on the shore and putting them on the boat. In fact, what happened is that the people along the coast would capture their enemies that were further inland, and they would trade them, sell them to the Portuguese. So when we talk about slave trade, there were actually Africans who were involved in slave trade as well as Portuguese. So that's just the way it worked. And that was, you know, these guys that lived along the coast thought this is great. We don't like those guys. They give us trouble. We can capture them instead of killing them. We'll sell them. We'll get something for them. And we get the added bonus. They're gone. We don't have to deal with them anymore. Those guys are gone. So that's what they did. All right. Now, they begin to sail further south, hoping they could get around the continent of Africa. By 1487, Bartholomew Diaz will, in fact, make it around the bottom of Africa. You'll start to realize, after he rounds the Cape, what he calls the Cape of Good Hope, because Good Hope of finally getting around this piece of land, that he's made it around. And he wants to keep going. He wants to keep going and see, if he could find India, see what he could do. However, his crew, his men, the men on the ship, the people on the ship said, no, we don't know what's out there. We have come a mighty long ways to get here, and we want to go back home. So he feared that they would mutiny, and so Bartholomew Diaz, you see pictured here on the left, from some money, and there's the Cape of Good Hope, kind of on the right, turns back. So he doesn't make it, but he is sort of the first European to round Africa that way and sort of figure out. Now they knew how big it was, how long it took to get there, so they could plan more for it. So here was his route in the red line that's on here. Starts up here in Portugal, comes all the way down and around, and then he turns back. He didn't like turning back, but he had to. All right? So actually going further is going to be left up to another guy. If you're looking for a good name for a son, how about Vasco? Huh? Probably be the only kid in school named Vasco. Middle name D, and then Gama, last name. Well, Vasco da Gama will actually round it, and he doesn't wait too long. 1497, because once they've kind of figured it out, they are eager to try to get to India, try to get to those spices, because they knew spices, a lot of money in spices. All right? Now, what does he do? After he rounds Africa, he starts sailing up the east coast of Africa, and guess what happens? He finds himself encountering now Muslims. I mean, there's Africans there, but there's also people there from Arabia and stuff, and Muslim ships. And so he goes into one of these ports. Of course, they needed supplies, they needed food and things. But he starts looking for a guy who's a navigator, saying he would pay, he would well pay someone who could show him how to get from where he was in East Africa to India. So he found a guy who was willing to do that, and they sailed to India, and they actually landed in India, and Vasco da Gama will return with a lot of spices and will make a lot of money off that first journey. And that's going to show and prove to the Portuguese this is doable. We can sail out of Portugal, we can sail all the way around to India, and we can get those spices ourselves, and we'll cut out the Muslim merchants in the middle. We'll make the profit. All right, so here's his route. You can see he gets to Mombasa and Malindi, and then he finds a navigator, I think at Mombasa, who takes him across to India. Of course, when you get into that area, there are trade winds, they're sometimes called, monsoon winds that will drive trade. And if you go at the right time of the year, it will take you to India pretty easily, and then you can come back in a similar way. So that's what he does. So Da Gama then arrives in India on May 18th, 1498. So he's actually arriving in India 6 years after Columbus. You remember a guy named Christopher Columbus? When does he sail? In what year did Columbus sail the ocean blue? 1492, right. This is 1498. And by the way, Columbus lands on Columbus Day. What are the odds? Anyway, so he sails into Calcutta, basically Calcutta, and he returns with the spices, and of course, everybody gets real excited. So now, the problem is, of course, the Arabs, the Muslims, have basically a head start on them. They control a lot of this, what they have found out is that they can now make it there themselves. The problem is, of course, the Muslims don't want them to control all of this. And so in 1509, the Portuguese will actually try not only to get involved in the spice trade, but from the very beginning, they want to control the spice trade. And they're going to do this by setting up a blockade on the Arab and Muslim ships. The guy who's involved with this is Admiral Albuquerque. You can tell he's from New Mexico. No, he's not from New Mexico. He's from Portugal. But that's where the city is named for him, evidently. Admiral Albuquerque then will make his way there, will set up a blockade, and in fact will establish a base of operation in Goa, the city of Goa, which is in southern India, on the west coast, south of Bombay. It's called Bombay at the time. Now it's known as Mumbai. They're going to use this as a land base for trade in India because they had to find a way to get the spices and things that they want, get supplies and all that. So, in fact, the Portuguese arrive there and get there in 1510. You know when the Portuguese leave? I think it's something like 1963. They're there a long time in Goa. I visited Goa a couple of years ago, 3 years ago maybe, and there's Portuguese forts there. Look a lot like even like St. Augustine, the fort there. And they were there for a long time, hundreds of years. The Portuguese controlled that port. Not only did they have that, but they put a blockade on the Arab ships, the Muslim ships, but they also regulated the ships from India because they knew what would happen. The ships from India would put the goods on it. They would sail out and meet the Arab ships somewhere outside of India, transfer the goods. They didn't want that to happen. They wanted a monopoly. There's where Goa is located. In the red circle, there's Mumbai, or Bombay as it used to be known. Well, once they get there, you know what they find out? They discover the spices, almost none of these spices are grown in India. That means that the spices that used to make their way to Europe were brought there by Muslims, who mostly, Arabs mostly, who got them in India. And guess what? The people in India got them way over here in Southeast Asia. So when you bought spices in Europe, you were paying the Indian merchants, you were then paying the Muslim merchants, and then you were paying your local merchant, right? That's part of the reason they cost so much. I mean, for us, we can go buy spices pretty cheaply. This time of year, people buy a lot of spices for Thanksgiving and stuff. You can go in the store and you can get yourself a pretty good sized container, say a cinnamon for $1 or $2, and black pepper, and cloves and allspice, and all these things that maybe you take for granted, but you can go to the store, Walmart or Publix or something. You could probably go in there and buy every single thing that they have every type that they have for probably, if you spent $50 on spices, you'd be getting a lot of spices. You could probably get about every kind they had for sale, right? But in this time, relatively speaking, spices were tremendously expensive, hundreds of times more expensive than they are today. But they found out they weren't coming from India. They're actually coming from islands further away. So guess what? The Portuguese begin to follow the Indian ships to see where they go to pick up the spices, right? And they find out that they're going to a group of islands called the Moluccas. So he sails there, and what does he do? Does he set up a deal? Hey, we want to buy your stuff. No, he just takes over the islands. They come in and take over the islands and say, okay, you guys work for us now, and you don't sell these spices to anybody but us. See, exclusive contract, a monopoly with the Portuguese. Also, they're going to use this area in Southeast Asia as a way to be a base of operations for them to go to China. And they will set up a base of operations in China as well. Okay? So, the Moluccas and the Moluccas are the Spice Islands. Here, this is where cloves, nutmeg, black pepper. You know, black pepper is the most used spice in the world. Of course, we have it here in the United States. You go into most restaurants, they have a salt and pepper shaker. Most people's houses on the table, they have a salt and pepper shaker in every kitchen, on every table, in every restaurant. Recipes call for that black pepper in a lot of stuff. But it is coming all the way from Southeast Asia originally. Yeah.
Okay, this is probably my lack of knowledge for the time frame. But when you're talking about the Spice Islands and the Moluccas and like talking about like nutmeg, so was it 200 years later that it became a staple in the West Indies islands, like Grenada?
Well, you know what happens is when these things will grow in one place, they try to test it out in a similar climate. Yeah. So in the West Indies, they were hoping they'd have all those spices, but they didn't at that time.
Okay. So then, are you going to talk about that later?
Well, maybe. But what ends up happening then is, in a variety of things, get moved around. For example, the growing of coffee, which we might associate with Honduras and Colombia and stuff. There was no coffee there. So that was moved there. And the growing of cocoa, cacao stuff moved from North America to Africa. And these spices will sometimes move to other islands like in the West Indies.
Okay. I actually was on the island Grenada.
Okay.
That I was raised thinking that nutmeg is because of them. But
not originally. I think it came there pretty early because of the climate.
Okay.
Yeah. Because these kinds of things, of course, won't grow in Europe. But once people are settling on those islands or know about it, they are actually bringing the plants and planting them, see if they'll grow. So, the Spice Islands then, as they are commonly called, you know, the Spice Islands are also home to the Spice Girls. You ever heard of the Spice Girls? It's their home island. You know, they've got, you know, one of those Spice Girls is scary. You know, I just thought all the Spice Girls should actually have spice names. You know, like ginger, pepper, I don't know, cinnamon. So, but one of them's named Scary. And another one's named, I don't know all the names. But you know, what I'm more interested in is their mother. You know what her name is? Old Spice. Old Spice. No? Okay. Well, other spices are here, you know, like there's black pepper, there's brown pepper, there's, you know, some of these are seeds, some of them they're called nuts, but they're really like fruits that are, you know, anyway. Some of it's bark, you know, like cinnamon is actually bark. But anyway, all of these things people had been cultivating there for a long time, but now the Portuguese have them. And I suspect what you have, say, in the Caribbean is probably the Spanish trying to create their own, you know, when the Spaniards come, they probably try to bring these plants with them. Well, anyway, here are the islands that we're talking about, just north of Australia, and not far from Malaysia and Papua New Guinea. We have these islands that are here in this area. There's a whole lot of islands there in Southeast Asia. And this is where most of these spices originate. Well, the Portuguese were pretty successful at doing this. They set up a monopoly. They came to dominate it. Why? Because they had great sailing skills, but they also had guns. They had gunpowder and guns, and they brought those into the mix. Say in Southeast Asia, people didn't have gunpowder, cannons, and guns, and so they were really no match for the Portuguese. Yes?
Didn't gunpowder originate from Asia?
gunpowder began in China, but it was not really developed into guns as weapons. I think we talked about that when we talked about China. They created the fire lance, and then the gunpowder did spread with the Mongols across to Europe. But the Europeans had really kind of, I won't say perfected, but enhanced that. And their use of firearms was there. Now, so a lot of these people did not have the gunpowder technology in Southeast Asia.
Like the ingredients?
Well, the knowledge, knowing how to make it, the ingredients to know how to make it, and then, of course, you're talking about a gun, you got a lot of, the metal working and, all the sort of details of that. So most of the real proficient gun making had really sort of moved into Europe. The Europeans became pretty adept at making firearms and cannons and stuff like that. So they were the first ones to begin to use it. The Muslims did have guns. They'd have gunpowder, but the Europeans were just better at it. Plus, the Portuguese ships were more nimble than the Muslim ships, I guess I'm saying. They could navigate them better. They could literally sail rings around the Muslim, the big shipping things. They had smaller ships, and they had cannons, and they knew how to use them. So anyway, if we want to see why they were successful, I think that's one. They had sort of the technology and the knowledge of how to do it. They were very mobile on the sea. Like I said, they knew how to sail and how to sail well, how to build ships that were, you could maneuver them easily. Of course, they had technology. The technology was, of course, gunpowder, but also navigation. Some of that they'd picked up from the Muslims and had adapted coming out of Spain, the astrolabe, and some of the other things that they were using to navigate on the open sea. But another thing is a single goal. The Portuguese knew what they wanted to do, and then they went after it and did it. Now, this is usually where I pause and say something about students and goals. I guess I will again. Right? In other words, at teaching, I've taught a lot of first-year students for a long time, and it's not always the brightest student that does the best in the class, or in college, or perhaps in life. It's the person who has goals and motivation. So, the question is today, what are your goals? Do you have any goals? If you have goals, what are they? And sometimes part of the problem, like with a course like this, is you and I have different goals. My goal is for you to learn this history because I think learning this history will improve your life and your knowledge and so forth. And your goal might be just to get out of this class and pass a requirement. Okay, so I try along the way to get you, trick you into getting interested in history, if I have to, or whatever, and in learning some things. I guess partially it's deception, try to trick you into it. But really, to be honest, a lot of it's up to you, your goals. So will you do well in this class? Will you do well in college? Will you do well in a career? A lot of that has to do with you. Okay? What are your goals? And are you focused on those goals? You might say, well, yeah, I want to graduate from college. Are you focused on it? What are you doing to accomplish that? If you're just going to be very passive, you're just going to kind of sit there and just sort of zone out, then you won't do as well in any of your classes. Yeah.
Do you still have goals, or is your goal just to help us with China?
My goal. Do I still have goals? Oh, yeah. Nobody's ever asked me that. Yeah, I still have goals. Yeah. Well, one of my goals, of course, is the hope that I can, try. I mean, I try to teach you things, right? I try to motivate you to learn. I try to make a environment that is conducive to that, right? In here, and of course I probably have other goals. Like someday I have a goal that maybe I could retire. That doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. So, that might be another goal out there. But then, of course, I have goals related to, my own life, my own, I like to do archaeology. I have goals of that. I could just start an archaeology minor here. A goal I would like to have, I don't know if it'll ever happen, would be that we would maybe have an archaeology major here. Or that the university would become involved in an excavation, sponsor one, and would really encourage people to go. I guess that would be a goal. Yes?
What's the coolest thing you ever dug up?
See, now we're getting far off the track. I would say probably dead people.
Whoa.
Yeah. Bodies, bones. Yeah, we dug up a tomb, first century tomb, and it had the bodies laying out that had been in coffins. And yeah, so you guys accomplished your goal now. You got me off of the lecture onto something else. Success. Anyway, so that's it. Yeah, and it was a woman. It was a pregnant woman. Yeah. It had the fetal bones in her abdomen, and it still had a gold ring around her finger, and earrings up next to her skull, gold. Her ears were gone, of course, but the earrings were there. So that jewelry does last longer than you. That stuff looked pretty good. She, on the other hand, well, I assume she had better days. But that was pretty neat as far as, going to this unrobbed tomb and having, seeing these bodies laid out, see the outline of the coffins and see all the stuff that's there. Lots of other things. All right, back to this. You should have goals, regardless of my goals, and whatever they are, you should figure out if you have any, and then how are you going to achieve those goals, and then to remain focused on those goals. If your goal is actually to graduate from college, are you really doing things to help you achieve that? Do you ever read any of the stuff assigned to you? Do you ever do the assignments that are assigned? Do you think about what you're doing while you're doing it? Do you pay attention in class? Do you ever take notes? I know that's pretty radical. In class? So a lot of times when people come to me and say, well, I'm not doing well in the class, I ask them all those things, just like I told you at the beginning of the class. Are you reading? And I find a lot of times people don't even own the textbook. So they're not reading. They don't read. They don't even have access to the book. Or they're not doing the assignments, or they're just doing it in a very quick, the easiest way they can. They don't really think about it. The whole point of the assignment is to get you to think about the material. Well, anyway, I won't belabor that, but this is why I think the Portuguese were good at this, is that they did have a goal. We may not like their goals or the way they achieved them, but we can say, yes, they were motivated, and they did achieve their goals. Well, of course, now this is going to push the people to try to find a different way to get there. You see, the Muslims had the overland route and the way through the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese now have firmly put themselves ahead on going around Africa to get to India and then going beyond that to the other islands, right? So now the Spanish, who are creating their own empire, they have a goal. They want to have a big empire, and they feel like well, Portugal's smaller than we are. If Portugal can do it, we can do it. So they get involved in this. They wanted to reach these spice islands, right? The place where the spices were. They were big fans of the Spice Girls. They have all of their songs. And so, a guy named Christopher Columbus, who's not Spanish, he's Italian, by the way, he will come to Spain and he will say, hey, I've got an idea. Instead of going south, like the Portuguese, let's go west. And they thought, well, this might actually work, because the idea was it might actually be a shorter way to get there, an easier way to get there, to go east by going west. Well, now I don't think a lot of people thought the world were flat at this time, but of course it was a unknown. You know, if you're sailing kind of along the coast of Africa, that's a little less frightening, I suppose. You could always make for shore if you needed to, maybe find some water or something, and help you regain your bearings. But if you're just heading out over the ocean there, they weren't exactly sure how far it was, and actually they thought it was closer. And of course they did not have any idea that there was a huge body of land, you know, North and South America, Central America. They didn't know that was there at all. Of course, they're going to eventually figure that out. So he was an Italian from Genoa. Remember, that was one of the cities we mentioned in the Italian Renaissance. He lives from 1451 to 1506. So he goes to the Spanish leaders, and by the way, Spain had just been unified. And they had been unified recently, and they had pushed out the last of the Muslims. The last Muslims were pushed out of Spain in 1492. Remember, the Spain showed up there, let's say roughly about 700, right? 680, 700. So they had been there for almost 800 years, Muslims. Now, there had been a conscious decision by the Christians in the north to move south and try to force the Muslims out, called the Reconquista of Spain, the reconquering of Spain. And that had happened, but not finished until 1492. Now, the size of the world, they had some idea. If they listened to the Greeks, you know, Ptolemy and others had estimated the circumference of the world, and he wasn't too far off. But they also, of course, thought that the land masses were bigger. You know what I'm saying? If Europe was bigger and if China was bigger, then that means there's less ocean between them, even if they're far apart. Does that make sense? So that's what they were thinking. They didn't know truly the sizes of the continents. They didn't, of course, know about the North and South American continents. So Columbus persuades this lady right here, Isabella of Spain. Her husband, of course, is Ferdinand, to give him a shot at this. So if the earth was a bit smaller, if Asia was a bit bigger, you know, he could actually perhaps make it there as fast or faster than the Portuguese were making it by going all the way around the continent of Africa. So Queen Isabella is convinced. Now, she had been a ruler of her own, had her own territory when she got married to Ferdinand, that merged their territories together and created a unified Spain. So that was all really new. So she had a lot of power on her own, and she decided this was worth the risk. So she said, I will finance your expedition. I will give you 3 ships to sail and supplies, and let's see if we can make this happen, right? And so, as you know, he sails out with the ships. He sails out from Barcelona. If you go to Barcelona, they have a big statue on a pillar of Columbus looking out to the water. And he sails out of Barcelona harbor and sails around through the Straits of Gibraltar, and then he heads out, eventually, of course, coming into the Caribbean. He reached the Americas on Columbus Day in 1492. So here are his ships, Nina de Pinta, and and he had a lady that went with him. Her name was Maria, Santa Maria. All right, so they're sailing out. They explore Cuba and Haiti. He thought he was near Asia. He thought these are islands, like the Spice Islands or some of these islands not far from, say, maybe China or India. He thought he was close to India. And so, in fact, he calls this area India. So this is, why those islands are now known as the Indian Islands, but then, of course, no, they're the West Indies now, they're typically called. So they're the Indies, but, of course, once it's realized the mistake, this is why the people were called Indians, because they're from India. And, of course, we've kept up that kind of name, at least in a colloquial manner, and that is how it happened. Now, what you may not know is that Columbus made return voyages. The 1492 one, of course, is the famous one for the rhyme and everything. He comes back the next year, 1493. He comes back in 1498. He comes back in 1502. And it's a bit unclear if Columbus ever actually realized that he hadn't found where he wanted to find. I think he kind of realized it, but he wouldn't admit it. You ever, I don't know if you've ever known anybody who's done that. But he just kind of went along with it and said, yeah, he had done it. But anyway, other people got to be clear that he had found something new. But he kept searching for those spices, and he did not find them. I'll show you a map here. I think the map is that next. Yeah. Look at all these places he sails. He goes all over the place. He goes, of course, around Cuba and Haiti, San Salvador. That's where he originally landed. But then, he goes down the coast here, near Panama and so forth. He comes all the way over here to South America, even, to the coastal areas of South America. That was in 1498. And he does not find any spices, and he doesn't find anybody who knows anything about the spices, And so he was, I suppose, unsuccessful finding the spices. Successful, I guess, in finding a way to a part of the world which no European had ever been to before. And of course, that's going to open the doors for the Spanish. Other explorers will follow in what we might call the race to the so-called New World. Right? This is a new world to the Europeans. And so it gets that name, the New World. The New World will then have, the English getting involved and others. John Cabot will sail for England, but he's actually also an Italian. And he puts the flag down in this land that he had just found, which he called Newfoundland, Newfoundland. And so, he claims that for the English throne. Of course, that's in southern, I guess you could say, southeastern Canada. He explored on down into the coast of what we now call New England, right? He did this for King Henry VII of England. He sponsored him. He did it in his name. All right? And of course, there will be others who follow. Here are some of the routes. Here's Cabot, right? Then we have, of course, Cortez. And he's going to come in Mexico, and he's really looking. And, eventually Cortez will cross the southern part, I guess you'd say, of Mexico today. And he gets over there and he starts sailing along the coast on that side. And so this sometimes is called the Gulf of Cortez or the Sea of Cortez. Other people don't like to call it that. They call it the California Sea or some Baja California over here. Anyway, I think once he gets over there and then he realizes that there's a huge another ocean over here, I think that's when he decided, you know what? I don't think we're getting to the spices this way. It's probably not going to be the best way. Ponce de Leon comes here to beautiful Florida, and you hear stories about a fountain of youth, which I think was in Lakeland somewhere. No. And so he comes in 1513. So the Spanish begin to sail in here, starting with Columbus. Then we'll see a lot of Spanish coming to the Caribbean, to Central America, South America, and so forth. Other voyages, Pedro Cabral. He is sailing, he wasn't intending on sailing across the ocean. He was sailing down, he was going to sail down along the coast of Africa, but he got in a storm that blew him off course. It might have been, like a hurricane kind of situation. You know how they form off the coast of Africa and then he come across here. At any rate, he gets blown off course and he ends up landing in a place he doesn't know, and then he claims it for Portugal, and that turns out to be, as you know, is Brazil. This is why Brazil is the only country in that part of the world that speaks Portuguese. They still speak Portuguese in Brazil, whereas everyone else speaks Spanish primarily. They have other languages too, but that's why, because Pedro Cabral got lost and then claimed it. So this then sets up a situation where you got the Spanish claiming land near to where the Portuguese are claiming land. Well, how about Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian? He's from Florence. He makes some voyages, and he's actually a map maker. In his several voyages, he's creating maps. So he creates maps of the geography of the New World. And you know how he signed them? Amerigo. And so people said, I need those maps, Amerigo's maps. And then the next thing you know, they just started calling it Amerigo area, and that became America. So how do we get the name of North and South America? Because of this guy. His name is Amerigo Vespucci. Just imagine if his name would have been Steve. North and South Steve. That'd have a whole different ring to it, wouldn't it? Then we would be Stevens. North Stevians or something. I don't know. Anyway. So his name lends the name to the continents, and we still use them today. America, North and South America, and so forth. All right, now that we have the Portuguese have come over this way, well, that's going to lead to trouble. Because it could lead to warfare between Portugal and Spain. So in fact, there is a treaty that's drawn up. It's called the Treaty of Tordesillas. Now, by the way, those are pretty good with some salsa and a little bit of queso. In fact, I wouldn't mind having some tortillas right now. Maybe get some with a little chicken on there. Chicken tortillas. Well, anyway, the Treaty of Tordesillas then is a meeting between Portugal and Spain, brokered by the Pope. Why would the Pope be interested in such a meeting? Why do you think the Pope would even care?
Money or power?
Money or power? Yeah.
Sorry, an entire region of non-Christians?
Yes. I mean, the Americas didn't have Christians, but who were the main players? Portugal and Spain, right? And what are those countries? They're Roman Catholic. Yeah, they're Roman Catholics. And so the Pope does not want Roman Catholics fighting each other, right? He would rather they cooperate, and then more will happen, right? Then of course, they can reach these pagans down here and not be fighting each other. So what happens is they draw a line. This red line you see here, it's called the line of demarcation. The line of demarcation is what it's called. And everything on the way we have it up here, everything on the right side, then, like the lower right, the Portuguese have access to that sea and those lands. Everything on the left side over there is the Spanish.
That seems very unfair.
Well, you know, it's true that, you know, they should have just given all that to Spain. Why let the Portuguese have that little piece? Well, yeah, you're right. No one else was invited to the meeting. You know, I mean, they divided it. Mainly they divided it so there wouldn't be a war or a lot of violence here near Brazil. If you want to watch a film over Thanksgiving that'll give you a little flavor of this, I think it's, what's it called? The Mission. You ever heard of a film called The Mission? It's got a guy in it named Daniel Day-Lewis, I think.
Jeremy Irons.
Oh, Jeremy Irons. He knows. That guy will never amount to anything. He was in there. I think Robert De Niro. Bob, as we like to call him in the business. Bob. Those two guys, those two unheard of guys are the stars of the movie. And it's basically set down here in this part of the world. And it's got a nice music, nice thing. I mean, I think, you know, probably on Netflix, I don't know. It's called The Mission. But it's an old movie now. It's probably from the late 80s, early 90s, you know, so it's 20, 30 years old now. But it's set at that time, and it's set with some of the conflict there between them. Well, anyway, so the Portuguese are going to control the Cape of Good Hope and over this way. The Spanish are supposed to control then the Caribbean, South America, except for Brazil. So the Spanish then were supposed to control kind of the Atlantic. They were supposed to control this part, you know, the part near Africa and the Cape of Good Hope. Now, of course, there was also kind of later on another line drawn when you get way over here, like around Asia, to demarcate it, because, you know, if the Spanish can go this way as far as they want, well, they're going to run into the Portuguese over there. So there was a kind of a potential for that. So we see the Spanish going all the way to, say, the Philippines and those areas later on. But originally, this was it, the line of demarcation and the Treaty of Tordesillas. Well, of course, the Spanish now, and we've kind of already talked about this, I suppose, a bit. The Spanish end up showing up, and they what they do is you know, they're going to conquer. They're going to take this land. This is our land, so we're going to take it. And so this is how Cortez comes. And, of course, they have superior weapons. They're metal weapons using iron. They have guns, you know, early guns, single-fire guns. They have horses. These are all things that, you know, these are unheard of in the New World. And, of course, with them, they're making first contact with these people. And there's a host of diseases that they had never been exposed to. Kind of like when we talked about China and Japan and so forth. Diseases came that way. Diseases come this way. Diseases like different kinds of influenza, measles, smallpox, all that kind of stuff is coming. And it's devastating to this population. So that, you know, if you want to point to just one thing, I suppose the disease would be main thing. But of course, you add to that their superior weapons and horses and swords and things that, you know, these people did not have. So they do conquer it. The conquistadors. Well, Hernan Cortez, 1519 to 1521, he is the one who will come into Mexico area. I believe he lands at Veracruz and makes his way across and will take over the Aztec Empire. Eventually the Spanish will take it all over. Right at its height of power, then later we'll see the Spanish will move northward, 1530s, 1540s, into the more northern parts of Mexico. and we'll take over that territory as well. Now, Cortez is there in South America. We've mentioned him before. His name is Pizarro, Francisco Pizarro. And he will move in to South America and will take over the Inca Empire at its height of power. So both of these, both the Aztecs and the Incas are struck down really when they're at their strongest, not when they're at their weakest, because of the disease and the superior weapons. And they are overwhelmed by that. And the Spanish take control of Mexico, Central America, and then down in South America, the Incas. And then, of course, the Portuguese begin advancing in Brazil, in the area of Brazil, by 1535. So we see all this happening in the 16th, basically the early to mid-16th century. The Spanish and the Portuguese are well rooted in North and South America. And they set up, basically an empire. These become colonies for them, and they then have goods, the raw materials that are coming from these. They discover, they realize the plants that are useful, like potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, right? These are all New World products that get transported, and then transplanted to the other hemisphere if it won't grow in Europe. But the potato will grow in Europe, even in Northern Europe, so it becomes a staple, say in Ireland and other places. Whereas some of the stuff will only grow in a very warm climate. And then once they have colonies established, there are colonies established in Africa, they'll begin to use Africa to grow some of these things as well, like cocoa plants and coffee. Coffee will then spread to, the Spanish will bring it to places like Honduras and Colombia, and it does very well there. So now I think probably most of the coffee a lot of people drink today actually comes from South America, even though it's not its original home. The stuff they really like, the coffee they really like, is you feed the coffee to like this little weasel, the coffee beans, this little weasel eats it, cannot digest it, and you can guess what happens to it then. It comes back out of the weasel, and then you take it and drink it. You pound it up and you drink it, and that is the most expensive coffee in the world, is partially weaselized coffee beans. I forgot the name of it. You can Google it. I'm sure you're Googling it right now, and you'll tell me what it is. But that is very expensive coffee. This is part of the reason I don't drink coffee. You don't know where it's been. You just don't know. All right, we'll end it there for now.